behaviors or actions.
Individuals with OCD experiencing sexual intrusive thoughts is quite common. In fact, as a clinician, I see more clients with sexual intrusive thoughts than either contamination OCD or checking OCD, some of the subtypes that most people know about and are more familiar. In fact, some studies show that 33% of individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder have either checking OCD or contamination, meaning about 70% of those with OCD have other subtypes, including sexual intrusive thoughts.
I think that this category and subtype of OCD is critical for us to talk about for so many reasons. One reason being that we often don't talk about it and we often don't hear about it. But what we know is that it is really common, and it's a subtype that a lot of us live with, and it's also a subtype that, just like the others, is treatable and can be managed with appropriate OCD treatment.
Sexual OCD is one of those subtypes that's very taboo, right? And a lot of people outside the OCD community don't necessarily totally understand, so this affects our relationships with our family members, our friendships, anything.
These thoughts, again, they're really common, and you're not alone in experiencing them, and they seem like they're less common than other OCD subtypes, but it's just because people are afraid to speak out about them. And so that's why education is so important.
In my early 20s, when the sexual intrusive thoughts were at their worst, it impacted my life greatly. I started isolating myself from other people. I stopped going out in public because I was having sexual intrusive thoughts with people that I'd run into when I was out shopping or in a public location. So I started isolating myself, only leaving the house for necessities late at night when I'd be around less people. I stopped going to family events and I stopped going to family holidays because I didn't want to be around my family because it brought in those thoughts of doubt if I was attracted to them or not. I lived with some of my family, so I stopped hanging around them and I started to isolate more and more. I felt a lot of shame and a lot of guilt, and I was disgusted by myself, which ended up having me completely hate who I was as a person.
My sexual subtype of OCD was mainly around being violent during sex and sexual assault. It was something, that I knew was not me, and immediately right off the bat, it was one of those OCD thoughts that I said, this is not me, I would never do something like that, but this is so intrusive, and the feelings, it gives you feel so real, and it's so terrifying, and you feel so alone.
My sexual intrusive thoughts have kind of run the gamut. I've had homosexual OCD intrusive thoughts, pedophilia OCD intrusive thoughts, and otherwise lots of different and various unwanted sexual intrusive thoughts. As I've lived with sexual intrusive thoughts, they were some of the first OCD thoughts that I had. They were disruptive, disturbing, anxiety-provoking, and frankly disgusting. They went so far against any thoughts that I would ever want to have and that I was okay with. And so I wanted so bad to get rid of them, to change them and to remove them forever from my mind frame because I hated them. And what I found is that the more I engaged in rituals, whether it was reassurance seeking or mental replaying to make sure I didn't do anything wrong, the more the thoughts came and the more power they had when they were there.
So my personal experience with sexual intrusive thoughts started when I was really young. I remember sitting at my desk with the chairs in front of me and scooting up to get closer to my desk to write and thinking that I was inappropriately touching another kid or something like that. And these thoughts were really distressing to me, and I kept them to myself for a really long time because I was very ashamed of them and had no idea what my parents or my friends and family would think. And as I got older, these thoughts continued, whether I were in a relationship with someone and to my values, trying to not do anything physically wrong and thinking that I did, asking them lots of reassurance. Also afraid that if I moved in with one of my best friends in college, that I could possibly be attracted to her when my sexual orientation was straight, and having these fears that I wasn't. And so all of these are really common sexual intrusive thoughts that come up for individuals struggling with this subtype of OCD.
Unlike some of the other subtypes of OCD I experienced, I felt a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, and a lot of stigma about my sexual intrusive OCD thoughts. The stigma was from what I knew about society. I knew society wouldn't ever be okay with somebody that was a sexual aggressor or somebody that was sexually attracted to their family. So the stigma was just overwhelming. I experienced so much shame and so much guilt that I didn't open up to my family or even my therapist, who I was seeing at the time for other OCD subtypes. I kept it from her because I didn't think it was OCD. I thought it was me.
And a lot of my compulsions were about saying a mental ritual in my mind as I was doing something until it felt just right, or even avoidance was one of my compulsions. I would avoid situations where I think I would have these obsessions. And, that hurt my social life, that hurt my dating life. And, I'm blessed with a great support system. And, I found somebody in my girlfriend that understands these thoughts and understands my OCD and is very supportive. But, it's tough to share those kind of thoughts with people and expect them to return that same support and that they usually do for your OCD. And I think that the stigma around the taboo of sexual OCD is so strong, and that right there tells me we need to do more about it.
What I've learned throughout the years is that when I have a sexual intrusive thoughts, whether it's when I'm changing a niece or nephew's diaper, or when I am just walking down the road, right? As we know, they can come for a certain reason or for no reason at all. If I engage in ERP and I lean into uncertainty and I don't try to get rid of the thoughts and push the thoughts away, that's actually when they do go away. And it's when the power that they have starts to lessen and the frequency that they come is much and much less.
My family saw me get so much better with other subtypes of OCD, but knew something was wrong and really encouraged me to open up to my therapist. Finally, because it had gotten so bad, I was able to open up to my therapist and explain what I was going through. It was one of the most difficult things for me at the time to open up to somebody, even though we had a relationship, about the specific sexual intrusive thoughts that I was experiencing. When I was able to open up to my therapist about the sexual intrusive thoughts and feelings and sensations I was experiencing, she identified them as sexual intrusive OCD. She said it was a subtype, just like the other subtypes I was experiencing. For me, that understanding from my therapist and her being able to identify it actually helped with some of the shame and stigma I was feeling. I was so happy to know that the gold standard OCD treatment, exposure and response prevention, also worked on this subtype. I didn't have to learn something new.
So what I'm here to tell you is that while sexual intrusive thoughts are really hard, they are also really treatable. You can learn to engage in appropriate ERP for your sexual intrusive thoughts so that they're not disturbing, so that you can have a life and a day where these thoughts don't come all the time and you're not anxious and wound up all the time. But instead, they still might come. Can't get rid of the thoughts overall. But you can be at a place where they can come and they can go without disrupting your life forever.
It's important for me to open up about my experience with sexual intrusive thoughts today because so many people don't even know it exists, doesn't even know that it's a subtype of OCD. So I want to normalize it for people, either individuals with OCD, their family, or somebody who just comes across this video. I want them to know that we have intrusive sexual thoughts, but that doesn't mean that we are those thoughts. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're somebody terrible. And I want people to know that they can get better and they can get help. By speaking out about this subtype, more and more people will start knowing about it. And that way they can identify it as OCD and get the help they need, which is finding a specialist in exposure and response prevention who specializes in the treatment of OCD.
I think the more information we get out there about sexually intrusive OCD subtype, the better. I know for me as an advocate, this is something that the past 7 years I have barely shared about. And most of that is because I'm very public about my mental health advocacy and my OCD. But if I want to get employed, what if my employer doesn't recognize what I'm talking about as OCD and doesn't understand the sexual OCD subtype? Are they going to hire me? It's just something that's so taboo and needs to be changed and needs to be a lot more understood because people with OCD are some of the kindest, most gentle people in the world. And we as a community can get over this setback of stigma, just like we have in the past with other subtypes and OCD as a whole.
If you are struggling with sexual intrusive OCD, I want you to know that I understand and I get it. I've been there, I've experienced it, and I know how difficult it can be. But by understanding that it's OCD and finding the proper help, you too can get better. There's hope. I want to leave everybody watching this video with this message. I know it's difficult and I know it's hard. And I know it's a struggle, but it's a fight you can win. If you find the proper help that you need, you too can get better like I have and get to a point that sexual intrusive thoughts no longer consume and command your life. You can get better and you can be in control every day of your life. You can make the choices you want and not let OCD and sexual intrusive thoughts infringe on that.
Sexual intrusive thoughts are taboo. We often don't talk about them. But the more we're willing to say, I have lived with those types of thoughts, and I still live with those types of thoughts. But guess what? I can manage them and I can live an amazing life where I can experience being present despite the fact that those thoughts might come and go, because I no longer give them the power that I once did when I would engage in rituals around them.
So make sure to watch all the other information that they have on sexual intrusive OCD here at Peace of Mind Foundation, as well as all the other stuff they have on mental illness and mental disorders. You're not alone, and there's hope and there's help out there.
Hello, everybody, and hi, Zach. Thank you so much for joining us today for Live with Liz. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good morning. How are you?
Good. Recovering from the conference and feeling excited to continue serving. How about yourself?
Same.
Good.
Always ready for this type of work.
Well,
Love
we're
it.
excited to have you here, and I just want to start with a couple updates. If everybody can please do two things for me. As you have questions, comments, thoughts that you want us to try our best to address, please put them in the right pane in the comment box. And let's start with just introductions. Tell us who's listening, say hi, and let us know where you guys are from so that we can say hi right back to you all. Couple updates as always. This is the Peace of Mind Foundation's Live with Liz. It happens the first and third Wednesday of every month at 11:30 Central Time, right during your lunch hour, depending on where you live, or for Zach, breakfast time. So good, you can have some coffee with you since he's on the West Coast. But so a quick reminder, which is that this is not therapy. This is not intended to replace therapy, but instead, this is an opportunity for us to share our personal background, experience, and hopefully a little bit of insightful education. If you're in crisis, if you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, please call 911, go to your local emergency room, or call your suicide hotline. Thank you to the Peace of Mind Foundation and to the International OCD Foundation for streaming this together and allowing us to do what we love, which is serve and hopefully positively impact people with OCD by telling our stories. Hi, Nicole. Hi, Rachel, Antonio, Kate, Rachel. So many of you that we actually got to connect with at the conference as well this past weekend. For those of you who attended the conference, remember you can watch a lot of the videos after. And for those who didn't, see if there's opportunities to connect so that you can also get access to the incredible talks and presentations that happened this past weekend. Today, we're here to talk about what the intro video was about, sexual intrusive thoughts. I saw a little post yesterday where somebody said, here's a great educational content piece, and it talked about the different subtypes of OCD, and they left off sexual intrusive thoughts. And my first reaction was to be really mad and frustrated, and instead, I think this is why we're here, right? It's about us remembering that this is one of the most common, one of the most frequent subtypes that individuals with OCD live with and experience, but it's also one of the least talked about for different reasons, like stigma and stereotypes that come along with it. And Zach, I would love to just start with, neither Zach nor myself are going to have time today to share our whole background and story. We would encourage you, if you didn't watch our talk at the IOCDF conference, please go watch that pre-recorded talk where we share a little bit more details. But today it'll be snippets and really Q&A. We had questions submitted in advance we're going to get to, and then questions that are posted live. But just a quick starter, Zach, I think after watching the video and us hearing all of us on the video share the same thing that you and I have talked about, which is that this is so taboo, and it's often one of the subtypes of OCD we don't really talk about. Why do you think, or why in your case would you say that often happened, where this subtype seemed scarier to address or scarier to talk about than maybe like contamination?
Yeah, it's a great question, Liz. And this was the first sexual orientation OCD. That was the first subtype of thoughts that I had. And I think the reason why these thoughts at a societal level can feel so taboo is just because, and as especially in America, as you see all of these wonderful movements that are taking place and have taken place across the country, you're starting to see that, people are more and more comfortable talking about their sexuality, whether they have OCD or not, right? Like that's just a part of their identity. And so I think that in the traditional sense, these thoughts are taboo because that's just how things have always been. But I do see a shift coming in society where more and more we can become comfortable with these thoughts because there are so many people in the world and in this country, especially. I know we do have people from outside of this country, and I've spoken to Antonio and other folks, especially in Latin America and South America, where maybe the culture isn't as accepting right now, but we can really start to wrap our heads around it's okay. It's okay to have these thoughts, and it's also okay to whatever your sexual orientation is, it's okay. I mean, that's kind of my perspective.
Yeah, and I think that, the reason these thoughts are taboo is not because they're real, right? But it's because they go so far against who we are as a person, our morals, our interests, what we want, who we're attracted to, right? They're the opposite. They challenge and push us, and then we can get stuck. But we're also oftentimes, people are afraid to talk about them because they're afraid of what will people think, what will people say, especially when we think about like pedophilia OCD or harm OCD, right? These thoughts are so disturbing for us to imagine that someone might think that it's real. I remember when I first started doing advocacy work years and years ago, that one of the first talks I ever did, at the end of the interview, the person said something like, wow, it's really crazy to think that OCD can make you act on these thoughts. And then the interview just stopped, and it was like, whoa. No, like OCD doesn't make me act on these thoughts. And yes, these thoughts are unwanted and intrusive, but it's the opposite. I would never act on them. They're so far from who I am. And that's why they're so bothersome. But I think especially when we think about like HOCD, as we talked about last on Saturday, it can go both ways. So somebody can be homosexual and have intrusive thoughts that maybe I'm straight and maybe I'm actually attracted to someone of the opposite sex, and that can be triggering, just like somebody who's heterosexual having triggering thoughts about being homosexual. So it goes both ways. It's not one way or the other. But I know we have lots of questions. Let's hop right in. So the first question is, how do you know you're not in denial about your sexuality? Sometimes it feels real and it makes me sad, but sometimes I accept it as OCD and the loop never stops. And Zach, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, just because I think when we're not in treatment, we often don't know how to appropriately fight these thoughts so that our insight and clarity picks up. So can you just explain quickly the difference between how you interpreted and dealt with the thoughts before you got treatment, and how actually destructive the rituals ended up becoming versus when you leaned in?
Yeah, and it's a pretty obvious distinction between the two. Before you get treatment, which is ERP, exposure response prevention, you just basically, you tend to latch onto the thoughts. So the thoughts come in to your head, and you interpret those thoughts as something that is real and valid, something that you need to actually give weight to. And you, in a lot of cases, for me especially, I know I just made it worse because I constantly tried to avoid the thoughts or push them down. And the harder that you try to not make the thoughts happen, the worse that they get. And so as soon as I started to do talk therapy, I did get some quick results in terms of a decrease in the level of anxiety that I was experiencing on a daily basis. And then over time, those thoughts lessened in terms of the frequency and on a daily basis. And it's kind of like I talked about on Sunday, this fog lifted, and it was like, without complete certainty, but with fairly good certainty, I could see, okay, I am a heterosexual male and I am attracted to my now fiance, and some of those questions that I had in my head that, you know, I couldn't get a clear answer on were answered indirectly. And I've been very fortunate, very happy about that. But the distinction is very clear.
And I think that this is what I'm constantly preaching, right, in my groups, and I did this morning in group here at our clinic, is it feels, right, OCD makes us feel and believe that in that moment we have to respond, we have to ritualize. And it really feels in that moment that the ritual is going to give us clarity, right? The like searching for bodily sensations, looking at a picture to see if we are aroused, right? That like, oh, well, if I just do that once, I'm going to know, right? But we never know. And the one thing Dr. Grayson says that I love is he's like, OCD convinces you that you need this level of certainty that's literally impossible to achieve. So you're trying all the time to achieve the impossible. And what you find is that the more you do rituals in a search for clarity, the more unclear things are, right? The more uncertain you become. And actually, the more stuck you are. As we all know, it rarely ends with one ritual, right? One turns into many and the cycle's hard to get out of. But instead, if we choose to feel uncomfortable in the moment, that's not what anyone wants. But if we make that choice, that is when, like what you just said, Zach, which is the cloud lifts.
Yeah.
Clarity comes and it's real and it actually lasts. It's not this search for more. It's a clarity that can stick. And it's hard to even explain. And for people who haven't engaged in ERP to understand it, because it feels so opposite. Right? Yep. Why would I purposely feel uncomfortable to try to feel better like that? How does that make sense?
Absolutely.
But it works. So the next question is, and I think it's a great question to really think about, and I'd love to hear your perspective, Zach, on how do you cope with the guilt and the regret related to these type of thoughts, right? These taboo thoughts often bring shame and not just discomfort, but like they go against our, maybe who, especially like harm intrusive thoughts, right? They go against our morals. Or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, there was a quote that I want to share with everybody. And you brought up a good point in just getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that is basically the definition of ERP and living with OCD, is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that was a phrase that I would tell myself every day. So I appreciate what you said on the first question. And I just kind of wanted anybody who can grasp, I'm a big phrase guy, big quote guy. So anybody who could use a quote, that was one that I used on a regular basis. So get comfortable with being uncomfortable in your treatment so that you can develop that muscle of uncertainty. With that being said, yeah, there is a lot of guilt and a lot of shame and oftentimes a lot of trauma associated with these types of thoughts. And for me, you know, the number one form of healing was through the ERP. I mean, that was number one, was going through the talk therapy and sort of starting to habituate to those types of thoughts. The second piece was discovering, and I didn't even know that peace of mind existed when I was first going through these thoughts. I would have loved this group. So I'm so grateful for all the work that you do, because the second thing for me was actually discovering from a girl at work that she had OCD too. I'll never forget it. I walk into the office, I'm inundated with all of these thoughts. Eyes are bloodshot. I'm depressed, anxious. I'm struggling, right? And at this point in time, I don't have a diagnosis. And I had just read an article about how some people with OCD are really, really terrified of cockroaches. And I looked down at my colleague's desk, and sure enough, there's 3 or 4 cockroach, like fake ones, sitting around her desk. And I was good friends with her. So I asked her, hey, will you go on a walk with me? And I just said, hey, is there any chance that you have OCD? And because I was just starting to clue in. I hadn't gotten a formal diagnosis, but I just started to clue in. And it turned out that she did. So this was the first person that I discovered had the same exact thought. She was like, I told her what the thoughts I was having. She's like, oh my gosh, I've had so many of those. So the second part of it was realizing, okay, I'm not alone in this. And then the third part was just starting to realize that you're not your thoughts, you're not your feelings, right? You do not have to identify yourself with these types of thoughts and then now write the narrative that you're a terrible person. I've had sexually intrusive, aggressive thoughts. And for the longest time, I would look in the mirror and I would be disgusted at the person looking back. But the reality is that I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my feelings, and I prefer to identify much more with my actions, who I show up as on a daily basis.
And I think that's key. You know, Zach, I think the fact that we can practice self-compassion and the critical piece of, like, despite these terrible thoughts and despite the way they make us feel, still being willing to look in the mirror and say, like, I love the person I am, or I'm a kind person, or I make a difference in people's lives, right? Those statements are really hard when we're in the throes and feel like we're a terrible person and that we're not the person we want to be, but they're critical to do and to keep front of mind. And then the second piece that I'll say to answer that question is ERP, right? Is that actually what happens is if we focus on ERP and we engage in ERP around these thoughts, the meaning of the thoughts and the intensity of the thoughts go away. And so oftentimes, at least for me, so does the guilt and shame, because that insight is there, right? I'm able to, it's hard in the moment for me to differentiate myself from the thoughts if they feel super real and I'm engaging in behaviors around them. But if the clarity is there because I've done ERP and the thoughts are thoughts and they don't mean anything to me or disturb me anymore, the guilt goes away too, because the thoughts don't feel like they're part of me, right? I have much clearer insight. So ERP actually works for this as well. So self-compassion and ERP.
Yep.
The next question is there ever an appropriate time to talk to your employer about your OCD? My OCD is around sexual intrusive thoughts and has started to directly interfere with my position. Sometimes I have to leave early or I have a panic attack due to the thoughts, and I don't want my boss to think I'm not capable of handling my position. What are your thoughts around this, Zach? Especially, like, you just talked a little bit about OCD really kind of starting when in the workplace or...
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a big question too when I started in the advocacy world. It was like, how far do I take it? How much do I disclose to the general population about the types of thoughts that I was having? And this is just, was my personal approach. But what I ended up delineating between was, I'm going to, in the OCD community, I'm going to take it there. I'm going to tell you, if you ask me a question, and Antonio, who I believe is still on here, knows this, I'm going to answer it honestly. I'm going to tell you every thought I've ever had, every sensation, every feeling, whatever it is. I'm an open book, and I want you to know. Because I feel like you deserve that, because we're kindred spirits. We go through the same battle that nobody else can see. But to the general population, I said, you know what? I'm going to take a more generalized approach, not because I want to continue that taboo stigma around these types of thoughts, but because I don't want to get caught up in the semantics. And so I said, I took the approach of, I'm going to explain to people that I've dealt with severe anxiety, deep depression, and thoughts of suicide. And I'm going to explain how those feelings have impacted my life. I'm not necessarily going to go deep into the weeds with somebody about the types of thoughts that I'm having and how they are now creating anxiety, depression, and thoughts of suicide. And so for me, if I were you talking to your employer, I think what's most important isn't necessarily the thoughts that you're having, but it's the result that you're getting from those thoughts, which is the panic attacks, is the anxiety, is the depression. So being very clear with your employer, which, by the way, by law, they absolutely have to respect what you're going through because it's a medical condition. They should understand and be willing to work with you around, either it's giving you flexibility from being able to work from home, when you come into the office, when you can leave, when you can go to your appointments to see your therapist, everything like that. So I wouldn't necessarily get caught up in going into the weeds necessarily and talking about all the thoughts, but instead talking to your employer about how anxiety, depression, panic attacks are just impacting your day-to-day and coming up with a strategy that works for both of you.
And Ethan and I talk about this a lot because we've talked a lot about when to tell your significant other, right? If you're in a relationship, when do you disclose and what's it like and what level do you disclose? And the reality is there's not a guidebook for it. There's not a handbook. It's what you're comfortable with and what makes sense. If I will tell you, my mom and my family has been very open about my battle with OCD and mental health conditions. And so her employees at our company and my dad's are much more apt to go talk to her because they know that she understands, right? They know that she'd be able to give resources and direction, and compared to somebody who you don't know how they're going to respond, you might share less. And so it's really about the relationship. But I think what Zach is saying is that actually most employees know when we're struggling. And so if we're willing to tell them a little bit, we don't have to tell them everything. You don't have to tell them the context or even the types of thoughts. But if you say hey, I'm very much aware that my work might be slipping a little bit lately, and I would love to have a conversation about why. It's not because of my abilities, but I'm struggling right now. I have a mental health condition and I'm seeking treatment for it. And this is my commitment, and I don't want it to impact work, but I want to talk to you about how I can get support to get back on track. I think we'd all be surprised that most people are pretty supportive. Not all, but majority are. And so it is really important for us to have those conversations when we can, whether it's jobs, relationships, kind of you name it. And I'm going to keep hopping because we've got a lot of questions. So the next one is, I'm a heterosexual female in a relationship with my boyfriend for about 2 years, and we're discussing marriage. The last few months, it's made my HOCD flare back up. Fear of being gay, even though I know I'm not and I don't want to be. I've battled with this one for years. Is it normal for it to be spiked by a new relationship? And what's the easiest way out when I have these tormenting thoughts? I've done ERP, but sometimes I get confused in the moment when I'm on my own. I feel like it's ruining the sweet romance of what I'm building with my boyfriend and future husband, and it's causing depression instead of joy.
So I've been there. I don't know who asked that question, but in every phase, like literally every phase of my relationship with my now fiance, soon to be wife, it's like every milestone was a new trigger point for me. And what I've come to realize, at least, and this is my belief system, is that I noticed that my OCD tends to attack the things that actually mean the most to me. And when I came to that realization, it made it really easy. It's almost like when I got engaged and my mind was like, oh, is this really what you wanted? Are you sure you're not this? Are you sure you're not that? Whatever it might be. I was like, oh, well, you know what? I just played the game back to the OCD. It's chess. We're playing chess with our own minds. And I just played the game back. And it was like, well, if these thoughts are flaring up, this is a sign that you really, really actually care so much about that person and the next step that you're moving into, because the thoughts flared up, and you know that OCD attacks the things that you actually care about the most.
Yeah, and 100%, the answer is yes. It's as Zach mentioned, it's just so common, right? Anytime we have big life changes, big new things happening, even COVID, right? Big stressors, vulnerabilities are increased. We know that's an opportunity for OCD to jump in. What's critical that you remember, especially when you're on your own, is that treatment doesn't change and treatment stays the same. So when those situations come, lean in. Maybe I am gay, and maybe I shouldn't be with my husband, and maybe or my future husband, and maybe, maybe I am a fraud, right? Lean into the things that are anxiety provoking, and then they won't have the same hold over you. And Thomas, to answer your question, it will actually give some clarity, because what happens is when we lean in, insight does actually increase, and there is more clarity when we fully lean into ERP. When we ritualize, the clarity and insight continues to go down. Next question is, I'm constantly checking to see if I'm truly attracted to the same sex. I'm nervous to do ERP because I'm scared my fears are going to come true. What if I have an unwanted bodily reaction? And I'll answer this quickly. The answer to it is that, what if, right? You might, and you have to lean into that, right? We have to lean into the fact that some of these things, they could happen, they might happen, but we won't know if we don't engage in ERP around it. Now, again, there's a big difference in engaging in ERP and leaning into thoughts than actually going and practicing or trying or doing something to test it out, right? Again, that's actually more not just counterproductive, but almost a ritual, right? Let me go see if this is the case. Let me go. No, we're not trying to prove that something's the case or not. We're not trying to convince ourselves that, in fact, we are straight or we're not straight. we're trying and encouraging you to lean into the uncertainty that you may or may not be, instead of trying to have certainty. Because the more we search for certainty, the more stuck we will always get. Next question is exploring sexuality versus being an OCD fear. And I think Zach and I talked a lot about this in our webinar, so I would encourage you to go back there. But really the big difference is a desire and something, and OCD can muddy this, right? It can make you say, well, maybe it is a desire, or maybe I don't know. If there's urgency to know right away, and you need to have certainty and you need to be sure, or if you're saying something like, I know I'm not, but what if, right? Probably OCD. Instead, if there's pleasure in the desire, if you like the thoughts and you want to understand the thoughts, or you're exploring the thoughts, that might be a little bit different, right? Again, remember the OCD thoughts are unwanted thoughts, but then it might make us feel like maybe the thoughts are real, or maybe we need to understand it, but they're still unwanted. They don't bring us pleasure, and neither do the rituals. Last question, I think, Zach, I'll let you take this one. It's great on the pre-submitted, then we'll get to some of the others, is how can parents best support their child? As a family member, do I help my family stay motivated and stop avoiding? What can they do? And what has it been like for you, for your fiance to support you and help you versus enable and reassure you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first step is always the education piece, and Peace of Mind Foundation and Liz and the team over there have a ton of different resources. So if you're a parent and you just want to have a deeper understanding, go over there, get some of the educational pieces, maybe even read a couple blogs from people who live with OCD so that you can get into their minds a little bit and kind of understand their behaviors, how they function, some of the thoughts and potential triggers that might pop up. But then from an actual, implementation standpoint and taking action, the biggest thing that my fiance did was she just held me accountable. So early on, I didn't want anything to do with OCD. I didn't want anything to do with ERP. I didn't want to identify as somebody who now had this anxiety disorder. And so weeks went by without me doing ERP. And of course, I just continued to tank and get worse. And she was one of the people that eventually was like, look, you're going to continue to feel this way until you do something about it. And so she was really a huge accountability partner for me at the start and keeping me motivated.
Wonderful. Next question is, how do you share with your partner, or do you, what's it like to share sexual orientation OCD with them?
Absolutely. Their needs, and Liz has talked about this, you have to make this read. And there are people that I've spoken to who they've been together with their person for 2 months, and they're like, should I tell them what I'm going through? And what I say is, it really just depends on your trust level. And when you're kind of in that puppy dog love stage with somebody, or, it's just like you're kind of jiving with somebody and you feel like you really know them. Maybe you feel like you can disclose all of this information right away. But from my perspective, I would say people need to earn the right to understand the intimate thoughts that you have. And so from my perspective, I waited, and I'm glad that I did, because when I did share, it was a very constructive, loving conversation, and not the other way around.
And I will also say, as a provider, I recommend when a patient is wondering how they can share and what it'll be like, to do it together in session with us. Have them come in, bring them in for a session, and we can talk about it. Because sometimes with that third party, when we're in the throes, it can be a little bit harder for us to explain it in an appropriate educational way versus like reassurance seeking or confessing. And it's really helpful, especially when it comes to sexual intrusive thoughts or relationship OCD, where the other person feels like it could also affect them. Being able to have a provider separate out the personal piece that feels personal versus it being OCD. One of the questions from Antonio was, what do I mean when I say lean into thoughts and uncertainty? What I mean is accepting the uncertainty, right? The point of OCD is to live with uncertainty. And so the point is, when you have these thoughts, and this actually goes to the next two questions. One was, how do you address mental compulsions and how do you stop from engaging them? And it's the same thing. It's leaning in. So when you have an intrusive thought of, am I attracted to this person? And you saw their picture on Instagram, and your immediate urge is to get off Instagram, avoid going back on, and to intentionally sit there and replay, am I attracted to them? Did I have a physiological response? Was I aroused? What has my past relationships with them been like, or experiences? And am I like, the more we try to have certainty and explore, the more stuck we get. And so when I say lean in, I mean lean in. I want you to intentionally say, like, I may or may not be attracted to my best friend Ashley, and like maybe we are going to end up in a relationship one day, and I've been gay the whole time, right? Lean in, accept it, think about it, like lean in that it could be true, not go explore, right? So I'm not saying I should go ask Ashley on a date and see if I am attracted and try to still do what I can to be certain, because again, that's just another level of trying to search for certainty that really would backfire. We would never recommend that as an exposure, but it's leaning into the uncertainty of maybe I am, maybe I'm not, and guess what? I guess I'll know one day, or maybe I'll never know. And for mental compulsion, same thing. When you have the urge to review or the urge to compulse, you can always undo it by leaning into uncertainty. So instead of searching, instead of ruminating, instead of replaying, intentionally say, maybe, maybe not statements. And then the last question that I'll really leave you with, Zach, and then I'll share my thoughts first and leave yours, is how long before you expect to see results? And this is a question we get asked all the time. And the answer is different for everybody. We know for a lot of people, 12 to 16 outpatient sessions. For some of us, we need more intensive treatment. But really, I guess the question for you that I would ask, instead of how long, because we don't ever know the answer to that, is when for you did it click? When did you know it was working?
Great question. And by the way, your example earlier was freaking spot on.
Thank you. It happens to all of us who've had it, right?
Oh my goodness. I literally just pictured that exact scene. So for me, and I think that you can speed it up with micro exposures, like the example that Liz just actually said. So like getting on Instagram and looking at pictures of Cristiano Ronaldo. Just saying, I heard somebody did that. No, that was me. I did that, right? Looking at pictures of Cristiano Ronaldo, not clicking off. He's a very good looking man. I feel very confident in saying that it doesn't bother me anymore, but once upon a time it did, right? But so just getting those little exposures. For me, it clicked once I started to take ERP seriously, and it became a part of my daily schedule until I didn't need it anymore, until I didn't need it to be something that I did every single morning. Because I worked with Dr. Irene, Liz, as I've shared in my story many times, and her thing was like, wake up and do your exposures first thing in the morning, because then you have the rest of the day to do whatever it is that you want. And so for me, it really started to click when I took my treatment seriously and I was committed to it. And I think that that's the big difference between people who really get results and people who kind of get results. And this particular genre of brain health is the ones that really lean in, and they're all in on the ERP, and they don't just kind of do it.
I totally agree. And we will wrap up with that, right? Zach's quote that he started with is the quote I want to end with, which is that we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And what I will say is when you commit to that, you will see results. It might be 1 or 2 sessions in, and it doesn't necessarily mean your work is done. But when you commit to the concept and principle that to get better, I have to feel not better. I have to feel uncomfortable. I have to feel anxious. The goal of treatment is not to remove anxiety, is not to make you feel better all the time, because that's not real. The goal of treatment is to allow yourself to lean in, to feel anxiety, to feel uncomfortable, and to not try to do anything to get rid of it, because that is when clarity and insight and the game-changing aha moments will come. Thank you so much, Zach, for joining us today, for your vulnerability and willingness to share on a topic that is often quiet and secretive. We in the OCD community so appreciate you, and we look forward to many more.
Thank you. Had a great time as always.
Great to see you. Bye-bye.
Great to see you. Okay, bye.